We've got something special coming up. CommonWealth Beacon and Mass Inc. are celebrating 30 years, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. Join us on May 14th at the State Room in downtown Boston for an evening with readers, supporters, and leaders from across Massachusetts as we celebrate 3 decades of original independent journalism covering Massachusetts policy and civic life. We'll also be talking about the future with Ali Noorani of the Barr Foundation and Marty Barron, former editor of the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, both sharing their thoughts on how CommonWealth Beacon can help Massachusetts move forward. To learn more and grab your tickets, visit commonwealthbeacon.org/30th or click the link in the episode description. Hope to see you at the State Room on May 14th. Tickets are on sale now.
As I've talked to business owners and chambers of commerce in Massachusetts over the years, one thing keeps coming up when they describe the struggle to hire and keep staff. Where do we house them? And that pain is especially acute in areas like the Cape and Islands, where the limited housing is pricey and increasingly kept off the market as second and third homes. So when you need workers, but there's nowhere for them to live, what do? Buy employee housing? I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm talking with Local Journalism Project Executive Director Janet Lesniak and State Senator Julian Cyr, who represents the Cape and Islands and also serves as the Senate's Housing Chair. The Local Journalism Project is the nonprofit partner of the Provincetown Independent newspaper, which ended up buying a condo for its reporters this year. It's not really the same model as sweeping so-called company towns of old, where large employers would build communities for their workers. But there's a long history of employee housing in these seasonal Massachusetts towns. So, how sustainable is that, and what does it mean for small businesses to become landlords? Let's get into it. So, Janet, Senator Cyr, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us. And it's good to be on a podcast with my constituent. A real icon in the town of Wellfleet. So,
please,
Janet Lesniak. So it's great,
and nice to see you.
I'll just sit here while you guys compliment each other. It's nice because we're talking about sort of employee housing on the Cape, and you're both here for kind of very different reasons, or at least slightly different perspectives on this. Janet, you're talking about kind of how your specific organization has been dealing with the struggles of whether or not its workers can, in fact, live in the place where they're trying to work. And Senator, of course, you have been looking at an entire region that has been dealing with those struggles, as well as having your own family experience with a small business that needs to figure out how to grapple with a housing shortage and employee needs at the same time. So why don't we start at the highest possible level here, which is, Senator, when is the first time you started thinking about the concept of companies providing employee housing?
Probably when I was in elementary school, and I think folks may know who followed my career. My family had a seasonal restaurant in North Truro for 28 years, Adrian's Restaurant. It was quite the institution for a number of years. But in the early and mid 90s, probably when I was in second grade or third grade, my family's restaurant was really struggling to find workforce, especially back of the house workforce. And my family's restaurant, like many small businesses and large businesses in hospitality and tourism in the 90s, started looking to, seasonal workforce, sort of beyond our shores of Cape Cod and beyond the country, right? So the H-2B visa program, I think you saw the first H-2B folks coming here in the late 80s or early 90s. Also a J-1 visa program. The H-2B is a seasonal work visa program. On the Cape and the Islands, largely that's been mostly Jamaican workers, but also people from other countries. And then the J-1 visa program is a student worker program. Historically, when I was a kid, it was probably a lot of Irish workers. But in recent decades, it's been a lot of Eastern European workers, but folks from all over the world to come. But the reality was you just couldn't find people to be line cooks or dishwashers or, busboys or busgirls, I should say, not to gender them. And that was sort of a real challenge, right? So my parents' business, bought a condo at one point for worker housing. We had a cottage on my adjacent to my parents' house where we had worker housing. Some seasons actually folks would live in my parents' house. We had, it's one of these old Greek revival Cape houses that could absorb a lot of people. But really, right? So like, very much you couldn't run a business without some sort of seasonal help. And really part of the reason why I think my family decided to get out of the business after 28 years. I mean, one, my dad, I think, was really, really sick of flipping eggs and having to work behind the line. But also two, because you were so at the whims of whether or not you could get help. And what's occurred, my parents, my family sold our business in 2012. And now in the 15 years since, that crisis in worker, basically worker recruitment, the inability to house workers, the need for businesses to provide housing for their workforce, that has expanded far beyond, the traditional hospitality, tourism, restaurant-based businesses, right? When you have a business that's open 5 or 6 months out of the year, you got a seasonal economy, it makes some sense that you're going to need to find some sort of off-Cape workforce to make that run. We've also had some other factors change in our economy. The economy here traditionally was sort of a Memorial Day to Labor Day sort of affair in the 70s or the 80s. We've worked really hard to expand our season. The season now, runs from really the beginning of May, through Halloween, or Spooky Bear, as we call it in Provincetown, all the way through December, right? That longer season, is really helpful, but it means that, relying on sort of college students to come and work, who'd be available in July and August, that hasn't been a factor for a long time.
And so, Janet, what does this look like from your perspective? Because as a, local journalism person myself, I understand that it's not just that the reporting happens during the high season. So what were you seeing in terms of kind of the difficulties in making sure that reporters were able to stay in the areas that they covered? And then were there any fluctuations essentially as the high season came and went?
I think that the bottom line is certainly, our specific situation with getting reporters and young journalists, and not just young journalists. We have been looking long and hard for a managing editor, and it became impossible. We had incredibly talented candidates who got here and said, no place for me to rent. I can't afford to buy anything. And we were stuck. I think what was different was businesses have been doing this for quite a long time. I myself own a hospitality business in California. We bought property 20 years ago for the same reasons. As a nonprofit, having worked in the nonprofit sector now for about 20 years on the Cape, that has not been happening. And we realized that we were beginning and ending literally every meeting with, wow, that's a great candidate. Where will they live? Until last June, when someone on our board, we were in a Zoom meeting with our board, that line came up, and one of our board members sort of went offline and got on Zillow and started looking to see what was literally in that moment, found 3 properties for us to look at that weekend, one of which was unbelievably well suited for our needs and unbelievably pricey in the center of Provincetown. And we made it our business to make it happen. It was kind of, when we sat there and my board looked at me and said, you think you can raise $500,000 in the next 35 days? It was a little frightening. And I think that a couple of factors. I think one, we had a couple of angels at the beginning to seed the pot. And it really spoke to the commitment of this community to the work that we're doing in educating young journalists, the commitment to the newspaper, because frankly, it was a sustainability issue. This was, without housing, the paper goes south pretty quickly.
And Senator, On that point as well, so Janet touched on a few things. One of them is that, the idea of employee housing and whether businesses have to build housing or buy housing for their employees has been a national question for quite some time, not just in seasonal communities, but it's especially pronounced in communities that have extremely tight housing markets that are getting tighter because of trends in vacation home buying and part-time home ownership or home occupancy, rather. So I guess where I'd like to start here is sort of this question of, is the assumption that it's always sort of going to be on the employer? Is there, some sort of assistance that you'd like to see available for that? Or is it basically, only the places that are able to somehow find $500,000 in that window of time then get to make sure that their employees have housing? Does that make sense?
I mean, this is my whole agenda. This is everything that I've been working on, and I can talk about some of the things, some of the some of the policies we've been able to deliver, some of the things that we're needing to do here. But I just really want to drill down that our failure around addressing year-round housing on the Cape and Islands and coming up with the resources, the financing to address year-round housing really means that it's putting the burden on businesses and business owners, and in a place where the vast majority of our businesses here are small family-owned businesses on the Cape and Islands, right? Family businesses like my family's. The barrier to entry, right? If you wanted to start a restaurant here in Provincetown in 2026 and not in 1984 when my parents started, right? Not only is it locating a location and finding a place you can rent or buy and buying kitchen equipment and setting the whole kitchen up, but you have to be able to have housing for your employees. And increasingly, when we see businesses change hands, it's not only the business that's changing hands, but it's the housing that's associated with it. So that just means the barrier to entry into our, for small businesses is in a seasonal economy is prohibitively high. And really, I think it's driving this consolidation that we're seeing. We're seeing more groups or some private equity groups coming in and purchasing these larger, these larger businesses, right? Think of the Provincetown Inn, the Crown and Anchor just, changed hands. And a lot of that's tied to, you're not only just purchasing the business, but also the housing. And so this is why you hear, when you go meet with our business community, come and talk to the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce or come to Nantucket with me and talk to business owners on Nantucket or on the Vineyard. Housing is the number one issue, right? And so our real failure on this is really further escalating the cost of doing business here. It also raises all sorts of, challenging, complicated questions about having your housing tied to your employment. Right? This is not sort of an ideal situation. This is not a situation that business owners are saying, "Hey, I want to also be a landlord, for my employees." Right? This has been, out of necessity. But what you're seeing across the region is that, our businesses, particularly when, you have long time, businesses who are looking to sort of transition, they're just not able to keep doing it. Listeners may be familiar with PB Boulangerie in Wellfleet. The chef owner baker is basically closing the bakery. He's going to do a small little bistro that he can just run himself, but he's closing the bakery because he can't find anyone to work in, and he can't find bakers to work in the bakery, right? So we're just going to be continuing to see that here unless we take real dramatic action to subsidize housing for year-round working people. The reality is, if you don't yet own a home or going to inherit a home on Cape Cod and the islands, you are no longer able to do so. That is what's happened in our real estate market. We've seen median home prices rise over 87% in less than a decade. When I was first elected to office in 2016, median home price was about $350,000 on the Cape and Islands. Now it's north of $700,000, and that's taking into account all of Cape Cod. I should say this is Barnstable County data. Come with me to Nantucket. Median home price on Nantucket is $3.5 million. So the pressure on our year-round economy, on our seasonal economy, is tremendous.
So, Janet, what the senator has pointed to there, these kind of escalating home prices, the escalating cost of rent, let alone buying it there, what did that math look like inside the nonprofit here? Thinking about there are two potential options, right? Can you raise someone's salary high enough to presumably rent something if there's anything available, but presumably as a journalist, you can't raise the salary enough that a single person can buy a home in Provincetown, so what was that trade-off? How were you trying to figure out, if we can find the 500,000, what does that let us do in terms of salary and what promises we can make to staff?
Well, it's twofold. One, I want to circle back for a second when the senator mentioned landlords as then the employer becomes the landlord. The Provincetown Indy, actually, we did an article exactly that, almost exactly a year before we decided to become landlords. So the irony was certainly not lost on us as we sat there and thought, oh, I never thought that a big piece of my job would be managing real estate. And there's so many pieces to that, certainly starting with the financial piece. Because of the way that the newspaper and the nonprofit are structured, we have sort of a hybrid arrangement where the Provincetown Independent is a traditional subscriber, advertiser, investor-based model with a nonprofit partner, the Local Journalism Project. And so it did give us the opportunity to work the philanthropic piece of it and reach out to donors and let them know what the problem was. Certainly, it's hard to imagine that anybody that draws breath on Cape Cod doesn't understand that there's somewhat of a housing issue here. It also allowed us, once we were able to raise these funds, what we were certainly cognizant of is the fact that reporters are not getting paid astronomical sums of money. There are no rentals. Let's just start there. They're at any price, unless you're coming, for thousands of dollars per week. So that really was not even an issue. What we also were aware of is that the capacity for the paper and the nonprofit to really raise salaries to the point where it would become manageable was impossible. And so the nonprofit actually subsidizes the reporter's rent at 30, they pay 30%. Gotcha. The nonprofit picks up the rest.
And so, Senator, one of the things that we were sort of heading toward and that we've alluded to is this has gone sort of far beyond, not to say just the small business, but that you're thinking about, hospitals are having trouble finding locations for their workers to live. What does this look like beyond just those kind of small local businesses?
So, this affects all employers across the region, right? The largest employers here in the region are hospitals or healthcare providers. Martha's Vineyard Hospital spent $38 million to build apartments for their nurses and doctors to make the hospital run and have some viability. Nantucket Cottage Hospital has had housing for workforce, and they're working to expand it. Cape Cod Hospital, the same. On the Outer Cape Health Services, our community health center, they're actually working to pivot to a pretty aggressive telehealth model, because the reality is they can't recruit doctors and physicians or other healthcare providers who are able to afford to live here. And look, this is a quite desirable place to live. Both Janet and I live on the Outer Cape. This is a vibrant, wonderful place. I mean, look, the commute to Boston sucks, but you don't have to leave. This is a wonderful place to live. But, you take one look at, $700,000 for a 500 square foot condo, if you're lucky, and even for workers who are highly skilled, highly paid, doctors, nurses, they just can't cut it in this market, right? So it really is on, all employers increasingly are having to figure out how do they find housing for their workforce, and if you're going to recruit someone here, housing has to be part of it. And in fact, this is now a real challenge for our communities, for our municipalities or towns. The town of Edgartown had a real challenge finding staff to operate their sewer system. By the way, they're now building housing, and they're able to now provide housing for municipal employees thanks to the seasonal communities designation, which was a law that we wrote and got passed through the Affordable Homes Act. But I just can't stress enough what what a real burden and a real barrier to economic development, and also just the vitality of our year-round communities that this housing crisis is. And we've had a housing crisis here for 20 years. The COVID-19 pandemic put that crisis on steroids. And now we're in a situation where it's really quite existential. And I think we're wondering about how do you sustain a year-round workforce in a place that has a tremendous amount of need. By the way, Barnstable County, this is the oldest county in New England. This is a naturally occurring retirement community here, right? Barnstable County has as many old people or older people as the villages of Florida, right? So, we also have to think about it from a health and human services perspective. If you don't have a workforce to provide services to the older people who are living here year round, again, another really big steep challenge, and it all comes back to housing.
And to get into a bit of the burden that we've talked about, what this sort of does to the employers themselves, especially the small employers, it might be a little bit of an obvious point to raise. But of course, if you're putting X amount of money into buying a condo, if you're putting that into, needing to figure out how to manage that, that's time, that's attention, that's staff hours that could go to something else, an extra reporter or something like that. So Janet, on that front, what ends up being the trade-off in terms of both the finances, but then also the attention that comes with now needing to make sure there isn't a plumbing issue in this house that you now have to monitor?
Well, that's a great question. We're pretty new at this. But what we're learning, and certainly what I have learned in my business in California, is it can be, it's certainly stressful. As you say, you have to figure out where to plug up the holes, literally and figuratively, because there's so many people and so many hours in the day, and nobody opens a restaurant or starts a newspaper thinking that they're going to have to be managing real estate at the same time.
And then thinking about, what else this could be going to, that question of, we've alluded to, we talk about, I'm a reporter myself. Anyone that's been doing journalism for any amount of time understands that kind of it's not an extremely well-paid position on the whole, especially on the local level. Local reporters famously are paid even less than, more established institutions or larger institutions. So thinking about what can then kind of be offered, is this offsetting one of the biggest things they'd have to be dealing with anyway, essentially, I guess, where housing costs are going to be such a big part of your salary to begin with? Does that sort of end up squaring out, or is there an imbalance somewhere?
Well, we're going to find out. And, stay tuned. One of the things that has been incredibly fortuitous, shortly after we purchased the condo in Provincetown, the word got out. Here you are. We've gotten a lot of press about it. And a very generous person in Eastham contacted us and has now donated a house that will likely be suitable where it required a lot of restoration, more money to raise, more energy, more effort, more focus. But what it likely will be is suitable for a managing editor. And I think that may be a game changer for us as we move forward. How that will, that has been the dream. Most people that are a little more experienced aren't willing to live in a 3-bedroom condo with 2 roommates that they did not select. So it's a little bit of a shift, but it caught the attention of someone who had the resources to say, you know what, here's an opportunity that I can give back. It's going to take more than, as Julian noted earlier, it's going to take more than one house at a time. It's a start. The Lily House, which is a local nonprofit, had a similar gift a couple of years ago. They've been very successful in their mission as a result of that. But I think that this is a much larger pandemic, for lack of a better word. It really is. This is life crushing. if it doesn't get solved in a very large strategic way.
So how does that sort of anecdote strike you? You know, it seems like it's not sustainable to just hope that enough people sort of have property and then feel sympathetic to whatever given business.
Yeah, I mean, notwithstanding the good fortune of the local journalism project and the largesse of one or two, very fortunate donors, that's no way to look at this problem. That's no way to solve this problem, right? And the reality is that for every local journalism project house that's able to be bought, right, we've lost 10 or 20, right? We have, more than 54% of renters on the Cape, on the islands, are cost burden, meaning that they're paying more than 30%. Many of them paying 40, 50% of their income on their housing. There's an entire social justice issue as well around, if you look at where folks are having to live, families of 10 or 15 in a two or three bedroom cottage, 4 people in a single hotel room. While there's some bright spots and some tenacity around trying to harness some local resources to cobble things together, that's no solution. And I think, the Commonwealth really needs to realize that Cape Codders and Islanders are facing a very dire crisis. And we are we are late to the game in correcting this problem. When I look at where in the country, the seasonal communities in the country, who is doing a good job solving this problem, right? We look to the Colorado ski towns, Aspen, Vail. They have had a year-end deed restriction model with a transfer fee on their luxury real estate transactions. They've been doing this since I was in middle school, right? We are so late to the game on this. And I'm really increasingly worried, particularly the island of Nantucket, the town of Nantucket has been, arguably done more than any other town in the Commonwealth on housing. They've had to. Provincetown's a good runner-up, but Nantucket really has been doing the most. They're increasingly really worried that they're not going to be able to step in and solve the problem with the tools that we're trying to replicate from the Colorado ski towns, the tools that the Hamptons have that we're trying to replicate, because the cost is just mounting so rapidly, right? We're now approaching about $1 million a unit to preserve year-round housing, or to build, and even more to build year-round housing. So this is absolutely a crisis. And I'm just not confident we will be able to sustain ourselves, as a year-round place that supports a heck of a big party in July and August, which, by the way, generates a tremendous amount of revenue for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, without a solution here, and without a revenue solution.
One of the things that the senator brought up earlier, Janet, that I'd love to get your take on is this question of, how good is it for housing itself to be tied to employment? The question of, is there, in your case, of course, reporters, but are there things that have come up as, of course, the Independent has reported on this dynamic changing over the years? Is there this sense that you could also be stuck in a place if you happen to be lucky enough to have an employer with housing that is dedicated for you, and you can't really leave because you can't bank on that elsewhere?
Absolutely. And I think that's certainly a concern of ours. I think it has been, as somebody who, as I said, owns a business and has provided housing for many, many years, it's the blessing and the curse. On one hand, one of our reporters, in one of the stories that's been written, he's living in this condo, and he says it's great. He doesn't, his brain isn't consumed with, where am I going to get the money for the rent, or where am I going to live when this falls apart, or when it's May and I have to get out of the housing that I've been in since October. Because that shuffle, the seasonal shuffle thing, not only is financially stressful, it takes a lot of space in your brain and body to do that. And again, if you look at it as a very large issue, the wear and tear on the people that live here and do that shuffle year after year after year, that is not sustainable for any community. It is just not sustainable. Julian and I were at an event last night where the outgoing ED, our CEO of that organization, spoke of how late to the party this community really is. and the importance of everybody not just having awareness, but figuring out what their part in that can be.
I think I'll give the senator the last word on this, which is the question of momentum and eagerness. Does it feel like there is, a push at the state level, which of course you're a part of, but only part of one chamber and one body here. So where is the energy? Where is like the effort? Is it actually going to meet us where we need to be?
Look, so I've been working on this since I got elected. This is the reason I ran, right? In part, if Cape Codders and Islanders of my generation don't step up, we're the only ones who can be here, right? You want to move to the Outer Cape or the islands at like 20, 30 years old without significant wealth, or marrying into a family that has a foothold here. Good luck, right? But really part of the reason I ran was like, Cape Codders and Islanders of my generation don't step up and solve this problem. This is just going to be a real sort of lifeless place that has a tremendous amount of wealth come into it 2 or 3 months a year, and that's going to be it. And to have grown up and to really see the erosion that has occurred here, our communities are eroding a heck of a lot faster because of this housing crisis than anything that's happening with rising seas. Look, we've made some tremendous progress here. Seasonal communities is a very big deal. This is something that Governor Healy championed, was included in the original Affordable Homes Act. The House sustained it. The Senate expanded on it substantially. There's been a ton of resources put in. And what seasonal communities essentially does is it gives our towns the tools to subsidize year-round housing, above affordable housing, to really do all of the policy housing related work that these other seasonal communities are doing. But the reality is, seasonal communities is not going to be at the scale of what we need without like a pretty significant chunk of money here. We estimate on Nantucket they have about a $500 million need. It's probably similar on the Vineyard. Across the Cape, it's probably more than that. This is why you look at what other places have done. Right, they've tapped into these high-end real estate markets. Right. The vast majority of sales, almost exclusively all the sales that are occurring, particularly on the islands, particularly on the Outer Cape, these are second and third and fourth homes. These are investment properties, right? I think that if you're able to buy a $5 million home in cash, you can pay a little extra to help us sustain a year-round community. So we're working very, very hard on this. But look, we faced headwinds, and we got far last session, but we're unable to get this tool, and we're just going to keep at this. But I can't convey that enough, that if we don't come up with a solution here on revenue, then this is really going to be over. And you'll have the oldest population in New England without healthcare providers and without supports. You'll see more and more businesses closing, unable to open, and you'll really see this place really collapse. And so, this is really catastrophic, and this is so tied to our economic vitality and really to the soul of this place. And that's what I'm fighting for. That's what Janet and so many of my constituents are fighting for. I mean, we're getting some pushback. Of course, but I think pushback also is indicative that, hey, you're up to something, right? You're making some progress on something. You're up to something that's going to do a heck of a lot of good. So if we don't get a fix here, this is really going to be catastrophic, and we are going to be unable to right the ship. And, these very special places that millions of people flock to summer after summer are just not going to be able to, are not going to be able to be attractive, interesting, vibrant places. These will just be enclaves for the richest among us. And unfortunately, there's been a trend of that happening in the society, in this country. I think we need a heck of a lot of a correction here. There is such unanimous support here on the Cape and the islands for taking this action. And, really, I'm asking my colleagues on Beacon Hill to really listen to Cape Codders and Islanders who are speaking in unison, that we need, help us help ourselves. That's all we're asking for here. And I'm confident if we're able to secure a revenue source for this crisis, we're really going to be able to do the big things that we need to do.
Okay, well, on that note, Senator Julian Cyr, Janet Lesniak, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Janet Lesniak and Senator Julian Cyr for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.